I was staring into the cold, black eye of a police officer's rifle, realizing my sister hadn't just called the cops, she'd called a hit on my freedom. My name is Chloe Vance. I'm 29 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed that even in the messiest families, there were lines you just didn't cross. I'm a paralegal by trade, someone who spends my days navigating the fine print of the law, making sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed. I've seen ugly divorces and bitter lawsuits, but I never expected to be the target of a tactical police takedown orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. It was 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, the humidity of a Georgia morning already clinging to the air. I was dressed in my best charcoal suit, my hair pinned back tightly, driving my white 2022 SUV toward the county courthouse. This wasn't just any day. This was the probate hearing for my grandfather, Silas Vance. Silas was a man of old-school principles and significant assets that he had entrusted to me. In his will, I was named the personal representative, the executor of his entire estate. It was a role I took with a heavy heart but a clear conscience. My sister, Brooke, felt differently. Brooke is 34, and for as long as I can remember, she's viewed the world as a game where she's the only one allowed to win. When the will was read and she realized I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom, her face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She didn't see a sister carrying out a grandfather's wishes. She saw an obstacle in the way of her payday. I was 3 miles from the courthouse, mentally rehearsing my opening statement for the judge when I noticed the first patrol car. It wasn't behind me. It was waiting in a crossover. As I passed, the lights didn't just come on, they screamed. Within seconds, 2 more cruisers appeared, boxing me in. This wasn't a standard traffic stop for speeding. This was a high-risk stop. "Driver, put your hands out the window, do it now." The loudspeaker boomed, the voice distorted and terrifying. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I did exactly what I was told. I rolled down the window, stuck my shaking hands into the humid air, and stared into the side view mirror. Behind me, 3 officers were positioned behind their open doors, their service weapons drawn and leveled directly at my head. "Open the door from the outside. Step out with your back to us." I moved like a robot, my brain struggling to process the reality of the situation. I stepped out onto the hot asphalt. The sirens were deafening. I could hear the clicks of handcuffs and the heavy breathing of the officers. "Down on your knees, cross your legs." As the cold steel of the cuff snapped around my wrists, tears of pure confusion began to sting my eyes. "Officer, what is this? I'm Chloe Vance. I'm an officer of the court. I'm on my way to a hearing." "Save it," the officer growled, his hand heavy on my shoulder as he pressed me toward the back of his cruiser. "We got a hit on this plate. Vehicle was reported stolen this morning, armed and dangerous." "Stolen?" I choked out the word. "That's my car. It's in my name. I have the title in the glove box." "The reporting party, a Brooke Vance, says you took the vehicle by force this morning and that you've been making threats against her life. She says you're unstable and trying to flee the state." The world tilted on its axis. Brooke. She knew exactly what time the hearing started. She knew that if I was detained, the judge would see my empty chair and her lawyer would move to have me removed as the personal representative for failure to appear, or, worse, for criminal instability. She wasn't just trying to get the car. She was using the entire police department as a tactical weapon to hijack the probate court. I sat in the back of that cruiser, the plastic seat burning against my legs, watching the clock on the dashboard. 8:45 a.m. The hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. In 15 minutes, Judge Sterling would walk into that courtroom. He would call the case of the estate of Silas Vance. Brooke would be there with her high-priced attorney, looking like the grieving, responsible granddaughter, and I would be sitting in the back of a police car, labeled a car thief and a violent threat. "Officer, please," I said, leaning my head against the plexiglass. "Check my ID, check the registration. My sister is lying to you. She's trying to stop me from getting to a probate hearing. This is a setup." The officer up front looked back at me, his expression softening just a fraction. He picked up his radio. "Dispatch, run the registration again on that white SUV. I need the primary owner's name and any secondary liens." "Copy that, Unit 4, running now." The silence in the car was thick with the scent of ozone and my own panic. I knew how the system worked. Even if they realized the car wasn't stolen, the process of unarresting someone, filling out the paperwork, and clearing the scene would take hours. By the time I got to that courthouse, the damage to my reputation would be permanent. Brooke had calculated this down to the second. She didn't need me to stay in jail forever. She just needed me to stay in jail for the next hour. Unit 4, registration comes back to a Chloe Vance. No liens, no reports of theft prior to 7:00 a.m. today. The reporting party is listed as a family member, Brooke Vance. The officer sighed and rubbed his face. He looked at his partner. It's a domestic. She's the registered owner. He turned back to me. Look, Ms. Vance, we have to verify the armed and dangerous claim before we can let you go. Your sister was very specific. She said you had a 9 in the center console and that you've been talking about ending things at the courthouse. I don't even own a gun, I screamed, the frustration finally boiling over. She's gaslighting you. She's trying to steal my grandfather's estate. I watched as they began to toss my car. My neatly organized folders, the original copies of the will, and my grandfather's personal letters were thrown onto the shoulder of the highway. My life was being scattered in the dirt because my sister had discovered that a single phone call could trigger a state-sanctioned kidnapping. I looked at the clock. 8:58 a.m. Across town, in a mahogany-paneled room, I knew Brooke was straightening her skirt and preparing to tell a judge that I was missing and unfit. She was winning. She was using the law to break the law, and I was powerless to stop it. But Brooke forgot one thing. I'm a paralegal. I know that the law is a slow-moving beast, but once it turns its head toward a liar, it doesn't stop until it finds the truth. The officers continued their search of my vehicle with a methodical, slow-motion pace that felt like physical torture. Every time an officer opened a new compartment or ruffled through my files, I glanced at the dashboard clock. 9:05 a.m. The hearing had started. Somewhere in that courtroom, Judge Sterling was probably adjusting his robe, looking at the empty seat at the petitioner's table. Brooke would be sitting there, her face a practiced mask of concerned grief, probably whispering to her attorney about my erratic behavior over the past few days. Nothing, the lead officer muttered, slamming my glove box shut. He walked back to the cruiser where I sat huddled and handcuffed. No weapon, no 9. Just a lot of legal paperwork and some dry cleaning. Because I told you the truth, I snapped, my voice cracking. My sister filed a false report. That is a crime in the state of Georgia. I need you to document this, and I need to get to that courthouse right now. Every second you keep me here, she's stealing my grandfather's legacy. The officer, whose name read Miller, looked at his partner. There was a flicker of realization in his eyes, the look of a man who realized he'd been used as a pawn in someone else's chess game. He reached through the window and unlocked my cuffs. The sudden rush of blood back to my wrists stung, but it was nothing compared to the fire in my chest. Ms. Vance, look, we had to follow protocol, Miller said, his tone shifting from aggressive to apologetic. The report came in as a violent carjacking. When someone mentions a firearm and a threat to public safety, we don't take chances. We're going to clear the scene, but I can't just let you speed off. I have to write the incident report. I don't have time for an incident report. I scrambled out of the back seat, my suit wrinkled and my hair a mess. I started grabbing my folders from the pavement, the precious documents of Silas Vance's estate now covered in roadside dust. Officer, if I don't get to that probate court, my sister is going to claim I've abandoned my duties. She's going to tell the judge I'm a criminal. You have to help me. Miller looked at the mess on the ground, then at the time. I'll tell you what, I'm going to radio the courthouse deputy. I'll let them know you were delayed by a police investigation based on a report that we've determined to be unfounded. It won't fix everything, but it'll put a pin in the judge's ear. Thank you, I breathed, shoving my papers into the passenger seat. I didn't wait for him to finish the radio call. I floored it. I drove with a focused, white-knuckled intensity, weaving through morning traffic like my life depended on it, because in many ways it did. Silas Vance had spent 50 years building a textile empire and a real estate portfolio worth millions. He had bypassed Brooke, his eldest granddaughter, because he knew her soul was made of salt. He knew she would liquidate his legacy for a penthouse in Dubai and a fleet of cars she didn't know how to drive. He had trusted me to keep the family together and ensure the charities he loved were funded. I pulled into the courthouse parking lot at 9:22 a.m. I didn't care about a spot. I pulled onto the grass near the entrance, grabbed my briefcase, and sprinted. My lungs burned as I hit the stairs. I burst through the double doors of courtroom 4B just as a man in a sharp navy suit was finishing a sentence. And given the absolute absence of the named personal representative, Your Honor, as well as the troubling reports my client received this morning regarding Ms. Vance's mental stability, we move for an emergency suspension of her appointment. That was Brooke's lawyer, Marcus Thorne. He was a shark who specialized in contested estates, the kind of man who would bill a grieving widow for the tissues she used in his office. "I'm here," I shouted, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. The entire room turned. Brooke was sitting in the front row, looking radiant in a black designer dress and a string of pearls that had belonged to our grandmother, pearls she had borrowed from the estate without permission. When she saw me, her eyes didn't fill with relief. They narrowed into 2 slivers of pure, frozen malice. She hadn't expected me to make it. She thought the armed and dangerous tag would keep me in a holding cell until noon. Judge Sterling peered over his spectacles, his brow furrowed. "Ms. Vance, you are nearly 30 minutes late to your own appointment hearing, and you look disheveled." "Your Honor, I apologize," I said, walking to the table, my heart still racing. "I was detained at gunpoint by the local police 3 miles from here. They were acting on a false report filed by my sister, Brooke Vance, claiming I had stolen my own vehicle and was armed with a 9mm handgun." A collective gasp went up from the few spectators in the room. Thorne immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a dramatic fabrication intended to cover for her obvious tardiness and lack of respect for this court. My client is deeply concerned for her sister's well-being. I have the officer on the radio with the deputy outside this door right now, Your Honor," I interrupted, looking Thorne dead in the eye. "And I have the registration of my vehicle, which proves I am the sole owner. Brooke Vance used the police as a tactical tool to prevent me from being here. That isn't just a family dispute, it's an abuse of the legal system." Judge Sterling signaled for silence. He looked at the deputy standing by the door, who nodded and whispered something into his ear. The judge's face went from curious to grim. He looked down at Brooke. "Ms. Brooke Vance," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave. "Did you, or did you not, file a stolen vehicle report this morning regarding the white SUV driven by your sister?" Brooke stood up, her lip trembling in a well-rehearsed display of fear. "Your Honor, I was so scared. Chloe hasn't been herself. She took the car out of the driveway so fast, and I thought she was going to hurt someone. I only wanted the police to check on her." "You told them the car was stolen, Brooke," I said, my voice steady now. "You told them I was armed. You knew I was on my way here. You knew Sela's named me executor, and you couldn't handle the fact that you weren't in control." "Enough," Sterling barked. "Mr. Thorne, sit down. Ms. Vance, take your seat at the table. We are going to proceed with the probate of Sela's Vance's estate, but I am putting this court on notice. If I find that any party has used law enforcement to interfere with these proceedings, there will be more than just an inheritance at stake. There will be criminal contempt." The hearing proceeded, but the air in the room was toxic. Thorne spent the next hour trying to pick apart the will, claiming our grandfather was of unsound mind when he signed the final codicil. He presented evidence of Sela's alleged dementia, mostly anecdotal stories from Brooke about him forgetting names or misplacing keys. It was a standard, ugly tactic: smear the dead man to get to his money. I sat there, my hands folded on the table, watching Brooke. She wasn't looking at the judge anymore. She was looking at me, her fingers twisting that string of pearls. She knew the police report stunt had backfired, but she wasn't done. Brooke always had a secondary plan. She was a master of the long con, and I realized that the roadside arrest was just the opening act. "Your Honor," Thorne said, leaning over the podium. "While we acknowledge the will's existence, my client has recently come into possession of a second document, a handwritten letter from Sela's Vance, dated only 2 weeks before his passing, expressing a desire to change the distribution of his textile holdings. We believe this constitutes a holographic will that supersedes the previous filings." My blood turned to ice. A handwritten letter? Sela's had been a man of meticulous record keeping. He didn't write letters to change multi-million-dollar distributions, he called his attorney. "Let me see this document," Sterling ordered. As the clerk carried a piece of yellowed stationery to the bench, Brooke leaned toward me, a tiny, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "You should have stayed in the car, Chloe," she whispered, so low only I could hear. "Because by the time I'm through, you won't even own the clothes you're wearing." I looked at the judge's face as he read the letter. His expression didn't change, but mine did. I knew my grandfather's handwriting better than anyone. I had spent the last 3 years of his life as his primary caregiver and assistant. I had typed his letters, balanced his ledgers, and read him the news every morning. If there was a letter, I would have known. And if Brooke had found one, it was because she had spent the last week in his study, looking for something she could create. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each second feeling like a hammer blow against my chest. Judge Sterling adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the yellowed stationery with a clinical, unreadable intensity. That paper represented the sudden, violent shifting of a multi-million-dollar tectonic plate. If the judge accepted this letter as a holographic will, the textile empire Silas Vance had built would be ripped out of the trust and handed directly to Brooke. "This is quite a development, Mr. Thorne," Judge Sterling said, his voice echoing. "The letter appears to be written on Silas Vance's personal stationery. It explicitly mentions revoking the previous distribution regarding the Vance Textile Group and restoring the birthright to his eldest granddaughter, Brooke." Brooke let out a soft, theatrical sob into her silk handkerchief. "He was so confused at the end, Your Honor. He realized he'd made a mistake by putting so much pressure on poor, young Chloe. He told me he wanted me to lead the company into the next generation." I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of water, but my voice was iron. "Your Honor, I have lived with Silas Vance for the last 3 years. I managed his correspondence. I saw him every single day. He was as sharp as a razor until the very hour he passed. He never mentioned a change in his wishes, and he certainly never mentioned a birthright. My grandfather didn't believe in birthrights. He believed in stewardship." "Ms. Vance," Thorne sneered, turning toward me, "is it not true that you were the only one with unfettered access to the estate's primary files? Is it not possible you simply suppressed any documents that didn't favor you?" "I didn't suppress anything," I fired back. "But I do know that my sister has spent the last week ransacking our grandfather's study while I was making funeral arrangements. If this letter was in that house, it wasn't in a filing cabinet. It was produced. Are you accusing my client of forgery, Ms. Vance?" Thorne's voice rose to a theatrical crescendo. "I'm accusing her of exactly what she did on the highway this morning," I said, pointing at the yellow paper on the bench. "Using a lie to hijack the truth." Judge Sterling slammed his gavel, the sound cracking through the room. "Enough. I am not a handwriting expert, and I am certainly not going to decide the fate of a $40 million corporation based on a piece of paper that appeared like magic 30 minutes into a hearing. I am ordering a stay on all asset distributions. This letter will be turned over to the court's forensic document examiner. We will reconvene in 48 hours. As the bailiff cleared the room, Brooke walked past me. She didn't look like a grieving granddaughter anymore. She leaned in, the scent of her expensive perfume cloying and thick. 48 hours, Chloe," she whispered. "That's just enough time for you to pack your bags. When that expert confirms his signature, I'm filing a civil suit against you for every penny you've spent from the estate account. I'm going to make sure you're as bankrupt as you are pathetic." I didn't answer. I watched her walk out, her heels clicking on the marble floor with the confidence of a woman who had already won. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The house felt like a trap, and Brooke still had the keys. Instead, I drove to the one place where I felt I could think, my grandfather's old office at the Vance Textile Mill. It was a brick building on the edge of town, smelling of cotton dust and history. The security guard, an old man named Walt who had worked for Silas for 30 years, nodded as I walked in. "Bad day at court, Miss Chloe?" he asked, his eyes kind. "The worst, Walt. Brooke is trying to overturn the will with a handwritten letter." Walt frowned. "A letter, Silas? That man wouldn't write a grocery list without making a carbon copy and filing it in triplicate. He hated loose ends." "That's what I thought too," I said, walking into the oak-paneled office. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The green shaded lamp, the heavy mahogany desk, the rows of leather-bound ledgers. I sat in his chair and pulled the letter from my memory. It was written on yellowed stationery. Silas had a box of that in his desk, Crane & Co. ivory, personalized with his initials. Anyone in the house could have grabbed a sheet, but something was bothering me. Silas had developed a slight tremor in his right hand during the last 6 months of his life. His handwriting had become larger, more jagged. The letter Brooke presented had looked too perfect. It looked like the Silas Vance of 2015, not the man I had helped into bed 3 weeks ago. I started pulling out his most recent journals. I spent hours comparing the loops of his L's and the cross of his T's. Then I saw it. On the very last page of his 2025 desk calendar, there was a tiny, almost invisible indentation. I took a soft lead pencil and lightly shaded the page below it. Words began to emerge, not a letter to Brooke. It was a list of numbers, 9/22/84, my birthday. But it wasn't just a date, it was a code. I looked around the room. There was a small, floor-standing safe tucked behind a curtain, an old-fashioned Yale model he'd had since the 70s. I'd seen it 1,000 times, but he'd always told me it was empty, just a relic he liked the look of. I knelt on the floor, my fingers trembling as I turned the dial. 092284. The heavy door clicked and swung open. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a single, black digital recorder and a small, leather-bound notebook. I pressed play on the recorder. This is Silas Vance. The date is October 14th. My granddaughter Brooke has been asking a lot of questions lately about the yellow stationery in my study. She doesn't realize that I noticed 3 sheets went missing yesterday. She thinks an old man doesn't see. She thinks I don't know she's been practicing my signature on the back of old bank statements. The voice was thin, but the mind behind it was as sharp as a diamond. I am leaving this recording in the event that Brooke attempts to use my own hand against Chloe. She is a girl of deep greed and shallow loyalty. If you are hearing this, it means she has finally made her move. Chloe, my dear, look at the second drawer of the file cabinet, not the front, the false bottom. I scrambled to the file cabinet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I ripped out the bottom drawer, reached underneath, and felt a latch. It clicked. A hidden compartment slid out. Inside was a legal-sized envelope, sealed with red wax. On the front, in my grandfather's shaky, jagged, late 2025 handwriting, were 4 words, "In case of treason." I opened it. It wasn't just a letter. It was a deathbed affidavit, witnessed and notarized by Walt, the security guard, and a local notary Silas had secretly brought to the mill 2 weeks before he died. In it, Silas detailed Brooke's attempts to coerce him into changing the will. He described how she had threatened to put him in a state-run warehouse if he didn't sign over the textile group. But the real kicker, the karma that would finish Brooke for good, was at the very end. Silas hadn't just protected the estate. He had set a trap. He had purposefully left out several draft signatures on those missing yellow sheets, signatures that he had intentionally misspelled or altered with a specific hidden flaw that only a forensic examiner would catch. If she presents a letter with a perfect signature, the affidavit read, it is a forgery. Because by the time she stole that paper, I was no longer capable of writing my own name without a flaw I chose to create. I sat on the floor of the office, the affidavit in my hand, and let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. He had known exactly what she would do. He had let her believe she was outsmarting an old man, all while he was weaving the noose she was about to put around her own neck. But I couldn't just walk into court with this. I had to be careful. Brooke was still out there, and she was desperate. If she knew I had this, she wouldn't just call the police, she'd do something far worse. I looked at the clock. Midnight. I had 36 hours left. I picked up the phone and called Detective Miller, the officer from the highway. "Detective," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I have the evidence of the forgery, but I need you to do me a favor. I need you to run a background check on Marcus Thorne's law firm, because I have a feeling Brooke isn't the only one who's been practicing my grandfather's signature." "I'm listening, Ms. Vance," Miller said. "The letter wasn't just on yellow stationery," I said, staring at the affidavit. "It was typed on a vintage Remington. My grandfather hasn't used a typewriter in 20 years, but you know who has a collection of vintage office equipment in his lobby? Marcus Thorne. It wasn't just a sister's greed. It was a legal conspiracy, and I was about to bring the whole house down." The realization that Marcus Thorne wasn't just representing Brooke, but was likely her co-conspirator, sent a shiver of pure, cold adrenaline through me. I stayed in that office for hours, the scent of old paper and cotton dust keeping me grounded. I knew that if I moved too quickly, I'd tip my hand. In the world of probate law, a smoking gun can disappear as fast as it appears if the person holding it doesn't know how to protect it. I spent the rest of the night scanning every page of the deathbed affidavit and the logbook Silas had kept. The logbook was the real treasure. It wasn't just a journal. It was a meticulous record of every time Brooke had entered his house, what she had taken, and the specific threats she had made. October 20th, one entry read, "Brooke arrived at 11:00 p.m. She smelled of gin and desperation. She told me that if I didn't sign the transfer for the mill, she would make sure Chloe was taken care of. I told her the mill belongs to the workers and the trust. She broke a vase on the way out. I am afraid, not for myself, but for the girl who is sleeping in the next room." My heart broke reading those words. While I was sleeping, thinking my grandfather was resting peacefully, he was sitting up in the dark, documenting the monster in our midst to protect me. He had spent his final days in a silent war, and I was just now joining the front lines. At 7:00 a.m., I met Detective Miller at a small, nondescript diner on the outskirts of town. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He sat down across from me and slid a thin manila folder onto the table. "You were right about Thorne," Miller whispered, glancing around the half-empty diner. "We did some digging into his firm's recent filings. This isn't the first time a holographic will or a lost letter has appeared in one of his high-value estate cases. There were 2 other cases in the last 5 years where the primary heirs were sidelined by a sudden change in the deceased's wishes. Both times, the documents were authenticated by a handwriting expert that Thorne himself recommended. It's a factory," I said, the pieces clicking together. "He finds a greedy relative, they produce a document, and he takes a massive contingency fee. My sister didn't just find a lawyer, she found an accomplice. The problem is proving the typewriter," Miller said, stirring his black coffee. "Even if we find the Remington in his office, we need a sample from it to match the ink and the ribbon strike to the letter Brooke presented in court. And I can't exactly walk into a top-tier law firm and demand to play with their antiques without a warrant." "I can," I said, a plan forming in my mind. "I'm still the personal representative of the estate until the judge says otherwise, and Thorne is currently in possession of several boxes of Silas's personal effects that he took from the house under the guise of legal discovery. I'm going to go to his office this afternoon to demand the return of a specific set of family photos. While I'm there, I'll get what we need." "That's risky, Chloe. If they catch you..." "They won't catch me. They're too arrogant for that. They think I'm a broken girl crying over her grandfather. They think they've already won." 3 hours later, I was standing in the lobby of Thorne and Associates. The office was a temple to excess, marble floors, gold leaf lettering, and just as I remembered, a glass display case near the reception desk filled with vintage typewriters. I saw the Remington immediately. It was a beautiful, charcoal gray model from the 1940s, its keys pristine and sharp. "Ms. Vance," Thorne said, stepping out of his office with a patronizing smile. He looked at my wrinkled suit and the dark circles under my eyes. "I'm surprised to see you. I would have thought you'd be at home, preparing for the inevitable." "I want the family albums back, Marcus," I said, making my voice sound shaky, playing the part of the defeated victim. "The ones you took from the study. They have photos of my father. They aren't part of the textile assets. Please." Thorne chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Everything in that house is currently under dispute, Chloe, but I suppose I can be magnanimous. Reception? Take Ms. Vance to the records room. Let her find her little photos while I finish my meeting with the forensic expert." He gestured to the receptionist, a young woman who looked like she was bored out of her mind. She led me down a long hallway toward a back room. As we passed the display case, I stumbled, dropping my heavy briefcase. "Oh, I am so sorry," I gasped, bending down to pick up my scattered papers. "It's fine," the receptionist said, reaching down to help me. While she was distracted, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, pre-inked piece of white cardstock. I reached through the slightly ajar side of the display case. The glass didn't lock and pressed the card against the E, T, and S keys of the Remington. It was a silent, 3-second maneuver I'd practiced a dozen times in my head. I tucked the card back into my sleeve as she stood up. "Here you go," she said, handing me a stack of papers. "Thank you, I'm a mess today." I spent 20 minutes in the records room pretending to look through boxes. When I left, Thorne was standing by the elevator, watching me. He looked smug. He looked like a man who had successfully buried a truth. "Find what you were looking for, Chloe," he asked as the doors began to close. "More than you know, Marcus," I whispered, though he couldn't hear me. I drove straight to the police station. Detective Miller was waiting with a crime lab tech. I handed over the cardstock. "The E on that Remington has a slight chip on the top curve," I told the tech. "And the T is misaligned by about 0.5 millimeter to the left. If the letter Brooke presented in court has those same imperfections, it didn't come from Silas's study. It came from Thorne's lobby." The wait was agonizing. 2 hours felt like 2 years. Finally, the tech walked out holding 2 enlarged photos. One was a scan of the letter from court. The other was a scan of the cardstock I just provided. "It's a match," the tech said. "The E is identical. The misalignment of the T is a mechanical signature. That letter was typed on the machine in Thorne's office, and based on the ink saturation, it was typed within the last 14 days. "That's it," Miller said, grabbing his hat. "That's enough for a search warrant for the firm and a warrant for Brooke Vance's arrest for forgery, perjury, and conspiracy." "Wait," I said, putting a hand on his arm. "If you arrest her now, Thorne will have time to shred the rest of the evidence. He'll claim he was a victim too, that Brooke used his office without his knowledge. We need to catch them together. The hearing is tomorrow morning. Let them walk into that courtroom thinking they're about to be crowned. Let them commit the final act of perjury on the record. Miller looked at me, a grin slowly spreading across his face. You've got a bit of your grandfather in you, don't you? I'm a Vance, I said. We don't just win, we settle the account. I went back to the textile mill that night. I didn't sleep. I sat in Silas's chair and looked at the black recorder. I thought about the roadside arrest, the gun pointed at my head, the dust on my suit. I thought about Brooke's smile when she thought she'd won. She thought she was playing for money, but I was playing for Silas, and in his house, the truth was always the final word. The next morning, the courthouse was crowded. The news of the contested Vance estate had leaked, and the gallery was filled with local reporters and curious onlookers. Brooke was there, wearing a white suit this time, the color of innocence. Thorne sat beside her, looking like a king on his throne. I walked in and took my seat. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the judge's bench. All rise, the bailiff called. Judge Sterling took his seat. He looked tired. He looked at the folder on his desk, the one containing the forensic examiner's preliminary report. We are here to resume the matter of the estate of Silas Vance, Sterling began. Before we hear from the court's handwriting expert, I believe the personal representative has an emergency motion. I stood up. I didn't look at my notes. I didn't need them. Your Honor, I said, my voice resonating through the silent room. Before we proceed with the verification of the holographic letter, I would like to present a new piece of evidence. It's an audio recording found in a hidden safe at the Vance textile mill made by Silas Vance 2 weeks before his death. It concerns the very document my sister has presented to this court. Brooke's face went from white to a sickly, pale gray. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Objection, Thorne shouted. This is an unauthenticated recording. This is a desperate attempt to. I'll allow it, Sterling said, his eyes fixed on me. Ms. Vance, play the recording. I pressed the button. The thin, shaky, but unmistakable voice of Silas Vance filled the courtroom. This is Silas Vance. My granddaughter Brooke has been asking a lot of questions about the yellow stationery. She thinks I don't know she's been practicing my signature. The silence that followed the recording was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. Brooke looked at Thorne, her mouth open, but no sound came out. There's more, Your Honor, I said, stepping forward. We have proof that the letter wasn't just forged. It was manufactured in the offices of Marcus Thorne. This was the moment. The karma was no longer a theory. It was a freight train, and Brooke was standing right on the tracks. The air in the courtroom shifted instantly. It went from a dry, procedural hearing to a suffocating pressure cooker. Marcus Thorne was a seasoned litigator. He'd spent decades dodging bullets and turning the tide of lost causes. But as my grandfather's voice faded from the speakers, I saw the first bead of sweat roll down his temple. This is an absolute outrage, Thorne roared, slamming his palms onto the mahogany table. Your Honor, this recording is a blatant fabrication. In the age of AI and deepfakes, we cannot possibly accept a grainy audio clip as evidence. This is a desperate, pathetic attempt by Chloe Vance to distract from the fact that her grandfather realized, in his final days, that she was unfit to lead his company. Judge Sterling didn't flinch. He leaned over the bench, his eyes like cold flint. Mr. Thorne, I am quite capable of distinguishing between a deepfake and the voice of a man I played golf with for 20 years. But more importantly, Ms. Vance made a very specific allegation regarding your office. She claimed the letter was manufactured by you. Brooke was trembling now, her white suit no longer looking like a symbol of innocence, but like a shroud. She reached out to grab Thorne's arm, but he shook her off, his eyes fixed on me. I would like to call Detective Miller to the stand, I said, my voice cutting through Thorne's bluster. Thorne jumped up again. Detective Miller, the officer who harassed my client on the highway, this is a coordinated vendetta. Sit down, Mr. Thorne, Judge Sterling barked. Detective, take the stand. Detective Miller walked up with a calm, steady gait. He looked like the personification of the law, unmovable and indifferent to the drama. He was sworn in, and I began the questioning. Detective, did you execute a forensic comparison between the holographic will submitted by the petitioner and a sample taken from a vintage Remington typewriter located in the lobby of Thorne and Associates? I did, Miller replied. And what were your findings? The typewriter in Mr. Thorne's lobby has a unique mechanical footprint. The letter E has a microscopic chip in the upper serif, and the T is misaligned by 0.5 millimeters. These exact, unique imperfections are present on every single line of the letter presented to this court as Silas Vance's final wishes. Furthermore, the ribbon ink on that letter is a high-carbon black variety that hasn't been manufactured in decades, but Mr. Thorne recently purchased 6 spools of it from an antique dealer in Savannah. We have the receipt." The gallery erupted. Reporters were scribbling furiously, and a few people actually gasped. Brooke looked like she was about to faint. She turned to Thorne, her voice a panicked hiss that carried to the front row. "You said the typewriter couldn't be traced? You said it was safe." Thorne's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. He realized too late that his own client had just confessed in open court. "Your Honor," Thorne stammered, his bravado finally crumbling. I was unaware that my client had used the equipment in my lobby. If she committed this act, she did so without my knowledge or consent. I am a victim of her deception as much as anyone." "You're a liar," Brooke shrieked, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at her lawyer. "It was your idea. You told me the original will was ironclad and we needed something personal to break it. You're the one who told me what to write." "Silence!" Judge Sterling shouted, his gavel coming down with the force of a thunderclap. "Bailiff, secure the doors. No one leaves this courtroom." The judge looked at the two of them with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. In 30 years on the bench, I have seen greed turn families into monsters, but I have never seen a member of the bar conspire to use the police and the probate system as a personal hit squad. "Mr. Thorne, you are hereby suspended from the practice of law in this courtroom effective immediately. Bailiffs, take Mr. Thorne and Ms. Brooke Vance into custody." As the officers moved toward them, Brooke didn't go quietly. She lunged toward me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. "You think you won, Chloe. You think you're better than me. You were always the favorite. You were always the one he looked at with pride while I was just the disappointment. I hope the money rots in your hands." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I watched as they put the handcuffs on her, the same cold steel she had tried to keep on my wrists just 48 hours ago. "It was never about the money, Brooke," I said softly as they led her away. "It was about Silas. He loved you too, but he knew what you were. He didn't bypass you to hurt you. He did it to save the company from the person you chose to become." The courtroom cleared out, leaving me standing alone at the petitioner's table. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of the morning. It was the silence of a house that had finally been cleaned. Detective Miller walked over to me. "You okay, Chloe?" "I'm tired, Detective," I admitted, leaning against the table. "I just want to go home." "You did good. Thorne's firm is going to be dismantled by the Bar Association, and Brooke is looking at 10 to 15 years for forgery and conspiracy. And that police report, I'm filing the paperwork for filing a false report and kidnapping under color of law this afternoon. She's not getting out on bail this time." I nodded, feeling the weight of the last 3 days finally begin to lift. I walked out of the courthouse, the Georgia sun feeling warm and honest on my skin. I didn't drive to the textile mill, and I didn't drive to my apartment. I drove to the cemetery. I sat by Silas's grave for a long time. I told him about the typewriter. I told him about Walt and the hidden safe. I told him that the Vance Textile Group was safe and that the workers would keep their jobs and the charities would keep their funding. "You were right, Grandpa," I whispered, touching the cool granite of his headstone. "She really did try it, but you were faster." I thought the story was over. I thought the karma had been fully served. But when I got back to my car, I saw a familiar black SUV parked a few spaces down. A woman stepped out, someone I hadn't seen in years. It was Marcus Thorne's lead paralegal, a woman named Alina who had always seemed too honest for that firm. She held a thick envelope in her hand. "Chloe," she said, looking around to make sure we were alone. "I heard what happened in court. I've been waiting for someone to finally take Thorne down, but there's something you didn't find in that safe." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "Thorne didn't just help Brooke forge a letter," Alina said, handing me the envelope. "He's been working with her for months, long before your grandfather died. They weren't just waiting for the inheritance. They were actively siphoning money out of the Vance Textile Group's offshore accounts while Silas was in the hospital." I opened the envelope. Inside were wire transfer receipts totaling over $5 million. The dates were from the last 6 months of Silas's life. Brooke hadn't just been waiting for him to die. She'd been bleeding him dry while I was holding his hand and reading him the paper. "Why are you giving this to me now?" I asked. "Because Silas Vance was the only person who helped my father when the mills closed 20 years ago," Alina said, her eyes moist. "He paid for my college. He told me to watch the shadows. I've been watching, and I think it's time the shadows were gone for good." I realized then that the fight wasn't just about the will. It was about the $5 million Brooke and Thorne had already stolen. It was about the final, hidden act of treason, and I knew exactly what to do with those receipts. The weight of the envelope in my hand felt heavier than the $40 million estate itself. $5 million. While I was sitting by Silas's bedside, whispering that everything would be okay, Brooke and Thorne had been digitally dismembering his life's work. They hadn't just been greedy, they had been vultures, picking at a man who was still breathing. "Elena, does anyone else know about these?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the rustle of the cemetery trees. "Only Thorne's ghost accountant, and he's currently scrubbing his servers," Elena replied, her face grim. "But these are the hard copies. Thorne kept them as collateral against your sister. He knew that if she ever tried to cut him out of the final inheritance, he could use these to send her to prison. He didn't realize he was the one who was going to fall first." I looked at the wire transfer receipts. The money had been moved through a series of shell companies, SV Holdings, Cloverleaf Logistics, names that sounded innocuous but were actually the arteries through which my grandfather's lifeblood was being pumped away. The final destination was an account in the Cayman Islands, co-signed by Brooke and a silent partner, Marcus Thorne. "Thank you, Elena," I said. "You have no idea what this means." "I think I do," she said with a sad smile. "Silas always said the truth is like a buoy. You can try to kick it under the water, but it's always going to pop back up to the surface." I didn't go home. I drove straight back to the district attorney's office. I didn't need Detective Miller this time. I needed the heavy hitters. I spent the next 4 hours with the white-collar crime unit, laying out the receipts like a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to a federal racketeering charge. By sunset, the probate dispute had officially evolved into a full-scale federal investigation. Because the funds had been moved across state lines and through international accounts, the FBI was looped in. Brooke and Thorne, who were already in county lockup for the forgery, were hit with a fresh set of warrants before they could even finish their first meal in a cell. The final hearing took place a month later. The atmosphere was different. The sensationalism of the forged letter had been replaced by the cold, hard reality of a criminal enterprise. Judge Sterling sat on the bench, looking older and more tired. He called the room to order and looked at me. I was no longer the disheveled girl who had burst through the doors after a roadside arrest. I was the personal representative of the estate of Silas Vance, and I was standing on solid ground. "Ms. Vance," the judge said, "the court has received the final report from the FBI and the forensic accountants. The $5 million has been traced and frozen. The process of repatriation to the Vance Textile Group Trust has begun. Furthermore, in light of the overwhelming evidence of criminal conspiracy, I am formally striking Brooke Vance from the will under the Slayer statute principles. Though she did not kill Silas Vance, her felonious actions against the estate disqualify her from any inheritance whatsoever." I felt a phantom hand on my shoulder, the same weight I used to feel when my grandfather was proud of a deal I'd closed for him. "The court also recognizes the extraordinary diligence of Chloe Vance," Sterling continued, "not only as a steward of this estate, but as a guardian of justice. The Vance Textile Group remains under your sole control. May you lead it with the same integrity your grandfather did." As the gavel fell for the final time, I walked out of the courtroom. The media was waiting, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions about the Vance scandal. I ignored them. I walked to my car, my SUV, which was now legally cleared of any stolen status, and drove to the mill. I gathered the workers in the main warehouse. These were the men and women who had kept the company running while Silas was sick. I told them the truth. I told them the money was coming back. I told them that their pensions were safe and that the Vance Textile Group wasn't going to be sold to the highest bidder. We were going to keep weaving. That evening, I returned to my grandfather's house. I walked into his study and sat in his chair. I opened the black recorder one last time. I wanted to hear his voice without the static of a courtroom. "Chloe, my dear," the recording played, a part I hadn't shared with the court. "Money is just paper and ink. It has no soul, but a home, a legacy. That is made of the promises we keep to the people we love. Don't let your heart grow hard because of Brooke. Some people are born with a hole in them that no amount of gold can fill. Just keep the lights on for me. Love, Grandpa." I turned off the recorder and sat in the dark. The karma had been served. Brooke was facing 20 years in a federal facility where pearls and designer suits wouldn't help her. Marcus Thorne was looking at a permanent disbarment and a matching cell. The system they tried to weaponize had turned its teeth on them, and they were finally feeling the bite. I realized then that the roadside arrest, the gun pointed at my head, the humiliation, it was all part of the audit. It was the price I had to pay to see the rot clearly. I stood up and walked to the window. Across the lawn, the old oak trees were swaying in the Georgia breeze. For the first time in my life, the house didn't feel like it was full of ghosts or secrets. It felt like home. I picked up the phone and called Walt, the security guard at the mill. "Walt, it's Chloe. I need you to do me a favor. Tell the guys we're starting the new shift at 6:00 a.m. And Walt, tell them the boss is back." I hung up and looked at the moon. Sila's was right. The truth had popped back to the surface, and I was the one holding the line. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments. What would you do if you found out a family member stole your home?